Roadkill, anyone? These Dust Bowl meals will show us what farmers ate to survive, and I bet they'll make you rethink every cup of coffee. Prepare to be shocked, and maybe a little grateful, for modern dining. No one knew that survival during the Dust Bowl would make people culinary adventurers. Boiled cactus pads, or as they're also called, no-pails. In the days when the pantry was bare and the garden was dust, people turned to the desert for dinner. To think that someone looked at a prickly cactus and thought, "Yep, let's eat that." Necessity is the mother of invention, and no-pails proved to be surprisingly edible and nutritious. The pads were stripped of their needles, carefully and boiled until tender, and had a tangy, almost lemony taste. They would chop them up, season them with whatever spices they had left, and serve them as a side dish. They were even thrown into stews, where their slimy texture acted as a natural thickener. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but when it came to survival, boiled cactus was a blessing in disguise. Fast forward to today, and no-pails are a delicacy in Mexican cuisine. During the Dust Bowl, they weren't about taste, they were about survival. Those desperate cooks never imagined what they saw as hardship food would one day be served in trendy restaurants. Cactus pads proved that even in hard times, resourcefulness can take ouch and turn it into yum. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Forget the meat aisle. What do you do when there's no meat? You make mock sausage. As you might have guessed, there was not exactly an abundance of food during the Dust Bowl era, so people started to experiment. The mock sausage was a mashup of anything remotely sausage adjacent: meals, flour, grains, breads, spices, and perhaps a little oil if you were fortunate. To make it, you would combine these simple ingredients into a paste, form it into patties similar to sausage, and then fry. The result? A breakfast sausage knockoff of sorts. But come on, nobody was ever deceived here. Nevertheless, the spices did their job, and in the worst of circumstances, one must do the worst of things. They ate mock sausage with whatever was available: bread, beans, or boiled greens, and it was a regular part of survival food. The mock sausage was not only about feeding people, but also about maintaining everyday life's appearance. It provided families an opportunity to consume something that at least resembled something they used to know. What is even more astonishing is how these recipes sustained spirits, and how it is possible for flavor not to disappear even when the ingredients have. Today, mock sausage is quite popular in the vegan and vegetarian community. But back then, it was about making a meal out of every single grain you had and ensuring that it was filling. This is what you can say about making the impossible possible. If life hands you corn cobs, make jelly. This creation of the Dust Bowl is the best example of use it or else it will be used on you. Indeed, in the old days when food was hard to come by, one could not even discard corn cobs. Yes, the very same cobs that you discarded in the bin today were used to make a sweet golden jelly that was related to honey in taste. The process was simple. Take the cobs, boil them to get the corn starchy goodness, add sugar and pectin, and you have corn cob jelly. It was inexpensive, convenient, and could be slathered on the constant companion of the Depression: bread. The taste? Light and sweet with a very subtle corn taste. And let's face it, when you are living off of crumbs, any type of jelly is a treat. Corn cob jelly may not sound like a dish that could be eaten today, but during that period, it was the best invention to solve a real issue. Everyone wanted to get as much use out of every kernel of corn as was humanly possible, figuratively and literally. Now it is a recipe that one might find in a rustic fare or a book of curious recipes, but in the past, it was a true example of people's creativity. At the very least, corn cob jelly makes us remember that life is a little sweeter when it's as corny as it is sweet. If you believe that using every part of the animal is a modern concept, you are mistaken. Dust Bowl families were not sparing any part of the pig, including the snout. Pig snouts breaded might sound like something you dare a friend to eat, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicacy. When meat was a rare commodity, the snout was a cheap source of something meaty, chewy, and quite palatable. The snouts were washed, cooked until soft, and then breaded before being deep fried to golden brown. The result? A crispy outside and a very tasty meat on the inside. Well, yes, the texture may have been somewhat unusual, but when you are hungry, you don't mind. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. To Dust Bowl families, pig snouts breaded were not just edibles, but a way to pay tribute to every pound of what little they had. No part was wasted, while such meals ensured that scarcity became resourcefulness. Nowadays, breaded pig snouts can be found only in some culinary forums, but they are a vivid example of how people tried to feed themselves when there were no chips, but snouts. Would I try it? To put it in perspective, if my grandma was to prepare it with a wink and a smile, I'd be willing to take a bite. Indeed, when you survive, you become brave and perhaps a little curious. But would you try it? Leave us the answer in the comments below. When life hands you a cow but almost nothing else, you cook the cow's brains. Fried cow brains, or calf's brains, if you want to sound a bit more gourmet, was a Dust Bowl specialty not because people wanted to eat it, but because they had to. They were not fastidious in the past. When you had to fight for your life, you ate everything that was on the animal. Now I know that fried cow brains may sound like something that shouldn't even be considered food, let alone something that might be considered delicious. For this dish, brains were washed in water or milk, dredged in flour, and fried until brown and crispy. Consider them as the first-generation chicken nuggets, if chicken nuggets had a soft core and came with a helping of angst. The flavor? It was mild, almost buttery, and that was the reason why nobody fled from the dish when somebody served it. Cow brains fried were dense in nutrients, especially protein, and thus a good meal during famine. While nowadays people might shudder at the thought of consuming brains, in the past, it was simply Tuesday's supper. And hey, if you put some gravy on top, it might just seem like you're eating gourmet food. Yes, you heard it here first, Skunk Stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten. Not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly-sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. Don't underestimate the versatility of cotton. It is not only used to produce clothes. When the Dust Bowl hit, farmers learned that they could take cottonseed, no joke, it's a byproduct of cotton cultivation, and make a loaf of something that could be eaten. Cottonseed loaf was the ultimate frugal meal, the idea of turning what was essentially waste into the main course. Cottonseed was poisonous and had to be cooked to remove the poison. Then it was ground and then added to flour, water, and whatever spices and leftovers people had. It's sort of like a meatloaf's distant relative, only there is no meat and, well, there's not a whole lot of taste. The loaf was heavy, tough, and by no means delicious, but it was quite healthy to sustain the people. The idea was not entirely radical. Cottonseed is very high in protein, and since it was already being fed to animals, it was only a short jump to try it out on humans. Spoiler alert, they could, but at the cost of a little pain. When the options are between cottonseed loaf and nothing, then the cottonseed loaf does not look too bad at all. Moreover, it is a good lesson on how people have to exist with what they have, even if what they have is cotton. No, this isn't a prank. There really was a dessert called sawdust pie, and people really did make it during the Dust Bowl. And yes, sawdust was used. Okay, not the sawdust in the literal sense, but the breadcrumbs or other leftovers that created the dry and crumbly feel of the pie. It was made sweeter, flavored with spices, and baked into a product that looked like a dessert. The main ingredient was frugality. Staple ingredients such as flour and sugar were rationed, and therefore cooks had to make do with available ingredients. Breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even ground nuts if one had been fancy, became the base for this pie. A little molasses or syrup added, and you'd have a dish that might not win the bake-off but can do the job of satisfying a craving in the middle of the night. The name sawdust pie alone would turn anyone's stomach, but it was actually food and, I must admit, rather creative. It was not about opulence. It was about turning the essence of food into a dessert, literally a crumb. Today, there are still recipes for sawdust pie, but they use coconut and pecans to make it a little bit more fancy. Would I try it? Of course, if someone says it is the new style and not the original straight from the Dust Bowl, because even a pie that goes by the name of sawdust needs a bit of appreciation, doesn't it? When the cupboard was empty and the garden was dust, you made rag soup. Well, they did not boil actual rags, praise heavens, but because this soup was made from the scraps so lowly that it was like throwing rags into a pot. Rag soup was made from water, a couple of carrots, or any other vegetable that was left rotten and, at most, a piece of meat or a bone if one were to be lucky. It was thin, hardly spiced, and was stretched to go around the whole family. You can consider it as the soup where the idea is more important than the substance. The beauty of rag soup was that it was a very versatile dish. Got a carrot and a potato? In they go. Found a pinch of salt? Jackpot. It was a meal that was prepared in a time of famine and at the same time creativity. And though it was simple, it gave heat and food during the worst conditions. Rag soup is evidence of the fact that Dust Bowl families were able to survive and cook something tasty even out of the scraps. Carrot tops, the lost greens that were anything but lost during the Dust Bowl. When fresh vegetables were out of season, nothing was thrown away, not even the green tops of carrots. Carrot top salad made these usually discarded greens into a rather healthy meal. The greens were chopped, dressed with vinegar or lemon juice, and combined with any leftovers of vegetables or wild greens that could be found. If you were really fancy, you might add some more olive oil or a dash of salt. The result? A sharp, sour dish that was anything but luxurious, but was instead a nutritionist's dream. Carrot Tops have a robust, somewhat pungent taste, so they are considered a luxury item in today's terms. However, as they say, when the going gets tough, the tough get eating, and Dust Bowl families were certainly tough. Fun fact, Carrot Tops are not only edible, but also rich in nutrients such as vitamin K and other vitamins and minerals. I'd like to try this salad, perhaps, if there is enough dressing to offset the bitterness. It is not something I would run for, but I do appreciate the creativity of using leftovers to get food. If there is one thing that the Dust Bowl did, it showed that although survival may not always be pretty, it is always impressive. You may think of weed as something you don't want in your garden, but during the Dust Bowl, it was the only thing that could keep people alive. Weed and root stew was another dish that families who were surviving on the edge of starvation could afford, which meant even the most unappetizing plants could save lives. This stew was full of wild greens, dandelions, lamb's quarters, purslane, things you dig up in the garden with your fingers. The stew was not gourmet, but it was filling. The weeds and roots were boiled in water with whatever scrap of meat or bone one could come across, a piece of chicken that had been used the previous day or some beef if one were lucky. The trick was to make it filling, and wild greens can do that. The taste was not gourmet, but hearty. It would not be a restaurant of the stars, but a restaurant of the gut. The roots were sometimes starchy, which was good enough for making a soup. Although calling it weed might not exactly make your mouth water today, wild plants were a great source of vitamins and minerals, much more than that yellowing lettuce in the back of the fridge. Would I eat it? Frankly, if I were in the Dust Bowl, I'd take that weed stew and turn it into my gourmet dish. It is evidence that when it comes to seasoning, desperation is the best thing. When the chips are down, you have to work with what you have left in the kitchen or pantry. During the Dust Bowl, that creativity resulted in a dish like bird egg soufflé, a name that sounds like a fancy dinner party, but the reality was that it was a way to make the most out of very little. Bird eggs were one of the few sources of protein after the agricultural collapse that is depicted in the novel. The name soufflé may give one an idea that it is some light, airy French delicacy. This was not the case with the dish. The bird eggs, probably quail, chicken, or any other small bird eggs, were beaten and then cooked with whatever was available like cornmeal or flour to make it more filling. It was not about making it perfect, it was about making it edible. The soufflé was then baked, and you had a fluffy though rather plain meal to get you through the day. Eggs, being rich in protein, were a vital resource during the Dust Bowl. They could be prepared in different ways, scrambled, baked, or fried. Thus, a bird egg soufflé may not be a five-star meal, but it could certainly give one the strength to go through a tough day on the farm. Would I eat it? Heck, yes. Who does not like a dish that involves eggs and ingenuity? Even if it is not a sophisticated soufflé that can be ordered in a French restaurant. Imagine a meal that's as simple as it sounds. Cooked the flour and water and made dumplings. Now, I know you're wondering, that sounds like something you'd make on a sad Tuesday when you have nothing else in the pantry. Well, you're not wrong, but during the Dust Bowl, this was a hearty way to fill up a family when food was so scarce that even the pantry felt empty. The components in this dish were as simple as 1, 2, or 3: flour, water, and a pinch of salt. The dough was then molded into small balls and then placed in boiling water to be cooked. Yes, it was simple, but it was satisfying and had enough carbs to get people through the day. If you were lucky, you could put some herbs or a pinch of whatever spices remained to make it taste better. But mostly it was about existence, not feasting. The beauty of this dish was that it could be made in large batches, and while the flavor may not have been over the top, it could feed a family when they needed it most. The flour was the only real staple many families had, and it became the base for many meals. This simple dumpling dish was an example of how a little could be turned into something more. For every great food substitute out there is always a terrible one out there as well. One of the more eccentric replacements was turnip coffee. Yes, you read that right, turnips instead of coffee beans during the Dust Bowl. At some point, coffee became too expensive or scarce and people had to improvise, and turnips became the new hero. The process included roasting turnips, grinding them to resemble coffee, and boiling them to make a drinkable concoction. Yes, it was not as delicious as the real coffee, but it was warm, it contained caffeine, sort of, and people got that extra dose of energy they needed. Moreover, it was not nearly as expensive as the real thing. It is hard to believe today, but turnip coffee was a great idea to solve a significant issue at that time. Turnips were easy to grow, they were abundant, and they could satisfy that hunger that comes with the loss of a beloved caffeinated beverage. Frankly, I'd like to try it only for the sake of trying it, but I guess I would need some really powerful cream to make it all possible. It's probably one of the most unique ways to get your coffee intake for the day, though. This is not a joke, but the next thing you will be hearing is peanut butter and onions. Exactly, during the Dust Bowl, people could not afford to use peanut butter in sweet spreads, so they had to make do with what they had, which was to add a savory touch to the sandwiches. The peanut butter and onion sandwich came from the need to have a salty, protein-rich sandwich that has a kick from the onion. Well, this may sound like the most unusual pairing you've ever come across, but the components were basic. A thick layer of peanut butter, onions thinly sliced, and served on any bread that was available. It was a good blend of the creamy, nutty taste of the peanut butter and the sharp, pungent taste of the onions, at least when one is hungry enough to take it. The sandwich may have been a bit of a shock to the taste buds, but it did the trick of providing a quick meal with protein, complex carbohydrates, and fat. Also, it did not cost much and was filling, two important factors during the Dust Bowl. Okay, it may seem strange, but if you had to endure the Dust Bowl, you would not think twice about making a sandwich with peanut butter and onions. It's a rather perverse example of how food innovation thrives under pressure. Supper sub. Avocado toast? That's not what life was like during the Dust Bowl. People were eating cactus fruit and spreading lard. Now you might be wondering, what on earth is a cactus fruit? Well, think of it as nature's candy. These spiny little fruits, also called cactus pears or prickly pears, were produced by cacti and turned into an important staple during the worst days of the Dust Bowl. These spiny wonders would be gathered, skinned, and the sweet and sour pulp could be eaten. Now here's where things get interesting. They didn't just eat cactus fruit by itself. No, sir. Farmers needed to add more substance to it, and that's where lard comes in. Lard, the rendered pig fat that many farm families kept in their pantry. So, they would beat the cactus fruit with a generous dollop of lard, and they could spread it on bread, crackers, or anything that was eatable at that time. It wasn't fancy, but it fed people. Well, yes, it might sound a little strange now, but cactus fruit contained vitamins and water, which was scarce. Well, it goes without saying that where there is a will, there is a way. And this combo is a perfect example of that. Oxtail. The cut of meat that might make you cringe at first, but during the Dust Bowl was a real hero on the table. Aspic, on the other hand, is probably something you haven't thought about since that one time you tried Jell-O salad at a family reunion. However, during the Great Depression, oxtail aspic was a good way of making a few pounds of meat go a long way without having to spend a lot of money. The secret to making oxtail aspic was, of course, the oxtail, which is a cut of meat that is famous for being rather sinewy and full of flavor. When farmers stewed the oxtail for hours, they separated the bones and fat, leaving them with a thick, sticky broth. They would then pour that broth into molds, let it cool and solidify, and there you have it, oxtail aspic, a gelatinous delicacy made from beef. The meat inside would set into the jelly, making it a perfect snack or dish on the side. It wasn't elegant by any means, but oxtail aspic was full of flavor and protein. It was a way of utilizing a cheap cut of meat and getting the best out of it as possible. Oxtail aspic might be the most underrated dish of survival cooking. Everyone knows that potatoes are a comfort food. But during the Dust Bowl, even the potato plant was used in ways that would make today's food bloggers cringe. Enter boiled potato vine soup, an ingenious creation that's about as far from the baked potato as you can get. It is the potato plant, the vines of which became an important food source when all other sources were depleted. The vines, which are normally thrown away, would be collected by the farmers, washed and boiled in water to make a soup. The broth was not very rich and had an earthy taste. Nothing special, but it would keep a man alive when he had nothing else. The vines also have nutrients that could sustain you, but it was more of a survival thing rather than something you'd want to eat. The soup was accompanied by what else was available, or perhaps one or two remaining vegetables or a pinch of salt. While today we may crinkle our noses at potato vine soup, it was a blessing during the Dust Bowl when any green and growing thing was fair game. At times, it is not about exotic tastes, but about survival of the fittest in this case being food. Have you ever come across those roadkill signs by the side of the road? Well, some people, especially during the Dust Bowl, benefited from those poor animals. Yes, canned roadkill was a grim but feasible way to feed many destitute farmers out there. You didn't have a butcher or a grocery store. If you saw something fresh on the side of the road, you didn't waste it. Farmers would gather up whatever animals had been hit by cars, squirrels, rabbits, even deer, and can them for future consumption. The process was basic. You'd gut and prepare the animal, put it in a can, and then close the lid. It might sound like something out of a horror movie today, but it was a real source for survival. The meat was loaded with protein and could be stored for long periods of time. Canned roadkill was not a gourmet dish, but it meant that people would not starve to death. Now, I know most people will say they'd rather die than eat roadkill, but honestly, if it were the difference between dying and living, I'd probably be the first one in line for canned rabbit stew. You do what you gotta do. Onions are one of the most common ingredients in many dishes, but during the Dust Bowl, nothing was wasted, not even the outer skin of the onions. I might have thought baked onion skins were something I would throw in the garbage disposal today, but they were a delicacy back then. Farmers would save the skins of the onions used in preparing dinner and then roast them with a pinch of salt and oil, and they turned out delicious. The skins, after roasting, became a sort of a chip. Well, it did not taste like the real onion ring that we have today, but it was crispy, salty, and made of ingredients that were easily obtainable, or, as we would call it today, the Dust Bowl version of a chip snack. Onions were fairly affordable, and it was a good way not to waste anything since they were simple to cultivate. Besides, they were full of antioxidants and other nutrients that could compensate for the absence of other more healthy foods. If baked onion skins were good enough to sustain life, they might be good enough for me. The Dust Bowl era was one of America's toughest times, but people still had to keep their tummies full. Here are 20 foods that kept folks going through this challenging period, and you'll be surprised to see how creative people got with their meals. Let's start with a Dust Bowl classic, canned tumbleweed leaves. So, the Dust Bowl was one of the worst agriculture disasters the United States has ever seen, and almost no crops grew. But even in these tough times, weeds like lamb's quarters and tumbleweeds continued to thrive. Families had no choice but to add this plant to their plates. Think of it as the broccoli of the 1930s. Kids weren't big fans of this meal option, but it did provide a good amount of fiber, minerals, and vitamins. Tumbleweed leaves were added to all kinds of different stews and soups. They might have not been the most glamorous ingredient on the shelf, but they got the job done by providing nutrients and keeping tummies full. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the Dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work, as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well. But when done right, it was totally worth it. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, pickling was a common practice during the Dust Bowl, and when you're not sure whether you'll wake up to a fresh harvest of fruits, preserving them is the way to go. And what's a better way of preserving fruits than pickling them? I mean, you could dehydrate nature's sweets, but picking is a whole lot tastier. Pickling involves soaking fruits in a mixture of vinegar, salt, and spices. Fruits like apples, peaches, and even cherries were pickled with sugar and vinegar to create a sweet and tangy treat that could last throughout the year. These pickled fruits were often enjoyed as a side dish or used to add a bit of sweetness to other meals. It's crazy to think that pickled fruits were one of the only sweet treats available during the Dust Bowl era. Remember when I said cornmeal was dirt cheap during the Dust Bowl era? Plus, it was almost everywhere, especially if you lived in Missouri or Kansas. Well, cornmeal mush was something Meemaw made every time we needed a nice, fulfilling meal. Think of it as the instant oatmeal of the Dust Bowl days. You just cooked cornmeal in water until it reached a thick, porridge-like consistency. It was often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar. Some folks even added a little molasses for extra flavor. Cornmeal mush was an affordable way to keep hunger at bay and provided a good source of energy. It wasn't a 5-star meal, but it was dependable, much like the comfort of a warm blanket on a cold night. Meats and chicken were too expensive, so people had to make do with veggies like corn. Now people who had chickens as pets had the luxury of eating hard-boiled eggs for breakfast. Let's be honest, we all love a sunny side-up, but hard-boiled eggs just hit differently. This classic breakfast food got a workout during the Dust Bowl. Eggs were a valuable source of protein and could be stored for a longer time. Eggs, when hard-boiled, had a longer shelf life compared to raw eggs. This made them a practical choice for preservation, as they could be stored and used over time without spoiling quickly. Plus, boiling eggs is easy no matter how challenging the times get. They could be sliced into salads, added to casseroles, or simply enjoyed as a snack. These weren't just a breakfast item. These eggs were also used in dinner meals and were often served with white sauce over rice. If you ask someone to name one dish that describes diets during the Dust Bowl era, bean soup is the first meal that comes to mind. Beans have been man's best friend through some of the tensest times in history. They've been used in different kinds of meals through thick and thin. Bean soup was the classic bean dish of the 30s. Beans were cheap and easy to store, so they were a staple in many pantries. Bean soup could be made with any type of bean, and it was often thickened with cornmeal or bread. The simplicity of bean soup meant that it could be stretched to feed many people, and it provided a good source of protein and fiber. Bean soup might not have been the most exciting dish, but it was a staple of the Dust Bowl diet for a reason. It provided essential nutrition, was easy to make, and offered a bit of comfort and warmth. It was a reliable and nurturing meal that helped families get through some of the toughest times. Hoover's stew got its name from President Hoover, who was blamed for the economic hardship of the 30s. It was a hodgepodge of whatever ingredients you had on hand, thrown together in a pot and cooked until it was tender. It might have included meat, potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables, and was a way to use up leftovers. The hot dogs provided protein, the canned vegetables added some much-needed nutrients, and the pasta helped to bulk up the dish. Hoover stew came about during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Folks had to pinch a penny so hard they'd make Lincoln cry, as they used to say. This stew is a tasty way to stretch $1 to feed more people or to make a meal with enough leftovers to take care of the next day's meals. Now, beans were a staple, and pairing them with ham was a Southern favorite. It was a hearty meal that would stick to your ribs. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good bowl of beans and ham hocks? A variation of this was known as the United States Senate bean soup, or simply Senate bean soup, which was a soup made with navy beans, ham hocks, and onion. It was served in the dining room of the United States Senate every day, in a tradition that dates back to the early 20th century. The original version included celery, garlic, and parsley. One of the two versions used today includes mashed potatoes. The ham hocks added flavor to the beans, and the whole thing was slow cooked until the meat fell off the bone. It might not have been gourmet, but it was definitely satisfying. Imagine a world without fancy desserts or indulgent snacks. Well, that pretty much sums up the Dust Bowl era for you. Enter milk toast, which was one of the only sweet treats offered in the 30s. Milk toast was a breakfast dish consisting of toasted bread and warm milk, typically with sugar and butter. Some fancier variations included salt, pepper, paprika, cinnamon, cocoa, and raisins. Milk toast was a popular food throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially for young children. Now, this was the first choice for those feeling under the weather back in the day. Yeah, it was the classic sick people food of the Dust Bowl era. Often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar, milk toast was a gentle food that was easy on the stomach. Turnip greens were a common green leafy vegetable during the Dust Bowl, when other greens like spinach and lettuce were a rare sight. I guess you can say crops had seen better days, so turnips were cooked down with a little bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. They were often cooked down with a bit of bacon grease or other fat to add flavor and make them more palatable. Whether served as a side dish, added to soups, or mixed into stews, turnip greens helped to round out meals and provide essential nutrients. Turnip greens might not be everyone's favorite, but they were a necessary part of the Dust Bowl diet. Last but not least, mulligan stew was the ultimate Dust Bowl survival dish. The Dust Bowl era was a time of scarcity, and people had to get creative with their meals. Mulligan stew was the epitome of this resourcefulness. It was a one-pot wonder, made with whatever ingredients were on hand. Meat, potatoes, carrots, and any other leftover vegetables could find their way into the pot. Mulligan stew might not have had a consistent recipe or flavor, but its purpose was clear: to provide a hearty, nourishing meal from whatever could be salvaged. If these dishes made you a little sick to your stomach, leave a comment and tell us which of these meals you'd actually try. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.